Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be talking about Gardens of the Moon, which is the first book of Malazan. This is my first review, and I decided to do this since I wanted to preserve my opinions, since I'm usually a very critical and very opinionated person. And maybe show my friends and see what I think about this in the future. Anyway, Gardens of the Moon, first book of Malazan. The author, Steven Erikson, is a noted, or maybe, I don't know if he's noted, but this is his second novel. He's only written one novel before, and some short story collections. And he was previously an archaeologist and also an anthropologist. So he's very much dedicated to... Maybe I should do like this. My hands are here. He's very much dedicated to culture and making this feeling like a living, sprawling world. I thought it was really interesting, since Malazan was born from a tabletop setting that he roleplayed with his friends before. Or maybe he still does, I don't know. And it was actually born from a screenplay that he took to several studios, and it was deemed too ambitious. And I don't know if that was for budgetary reasons or story reasons, but anyway, he decided to make it into a novel with his friend Ian Cameron Esselmont, who also have written a bunch of companion novels. The thing about Malazan is that it is this gigantic epic, only comparable to like The Wheel of Time. It is 10 main series books, and then there are like 6 or 7 companion novels. Unfortunately I can't show you the book to you, since I borrowed it to a friend to see what she thinks of it. And it is very much reflective that he designed this world before he started writing it to a great extent. Within the history of the world, it's insanely detailed, or I can't really know, but it feels insanely detailed, and that's what's important, since he had all these maps and all these races and all this backstory from beforehand when we played tabletop with his friends. And just to start you off with this world, it's a very high fantasy world. There are a lot of non-human races. There is a great emphasis on magic, and this is a world where gigantic floating fortresses throws down gigantic fireballs and attacks with giant crows. But it also is a world where he mixes this high fantasy with the darker realities of war and the sacrifices needed to be made, which I thought was a really cool way to do it. The most important thing with this world is that he just throws you right into it. There are a lot of names being tossed out, like what is the deck of dragons, what is a war, and what's the difference between Tala, Nimas, and the Tista Andai, which you don't really know are races beforehand. And it's this insane world building that's very much interesting in this book. Usually, if you're a reader that needs to know this beforehand, then this is not really the book for you. That's not negative, it's just a preference, and in some cases I think this is very needless, since usually he throws you into sort of in medias res, as you say in Latin, and he throws you into it and you don't get what's going on very much at all, but then he slowly starts explaining things, and it's mostly just a game of waiting for him to explain what these things mean, since he wants to find a natural context for it, since he refuses to do it through narration, like usually fantasy authors do. The whole thing about the world building, it's mostly a waiting game, but there are still very cool foreshadowy things that you can pick up on, and hopefully it makes the book a more compelling experience, since this entire world makes you feel really smart when you figure something out. For example, in the first book, I can't really show you here, since I've, like I said, I lent it to someone. But the first book has this, after the prologue, which is like 8 pages, it has this poem about how the emperor of the Malazan Empire is dead. The emperor is dead and his right hand severed. And from their shadows, 7 chimes start ringing. And at the same time, you get to know that the new Warren has opened, which is the God's Dimension, and 2 new people rule it now. We have Shadowthrone and his right hand, Cotillion, who's also known as the Rope. And with them come 7 Hounds of Shadow. And guess who those people are? I can't really confirm this, so it would be really embarrassing if I'm wrong, since I've only read the first book. But it can make you feel really smart, and that's very much a plus, and it makes the world feel alive. If we were going to talk about the world, actually, it's this. Basically, the Empire of Malazan has ruled for thousands of years, and they're having this 100-year conquest of just eating up our city-states and conquering most of it. And then the emperor dies and gets replaced by the empress, Malazan, and she forms this assassin task squad, and she becomes much more aggressive in their expansion. And most of this book takes place on the continent of Genebacus, which is described as it's a murder out there in the Genebacus campaign. And it's about the Malazan conquest and how they've conquered every city there, except for one of the 12 free cities, which are these big city-states. And the book follows mostly a commander in the Malazan army and his so-called bridge burners, called Whiskey Jack. It follows a soldier called Paran, and the adjunct of the Empress called Lauren, something like that. Names are hard to pronounce, guys. But also inhabitants of this last standing free city, which is the last target that the Malazan has to conquer on Genebacus. The city is called Darujistan. And it follows the inhabitants that, like an assassin, the head of the Mages Guild there, and a whole crew of thieves and friends that are just thrown in there. And it's a very large cast to keep track of, and the entire thing just follows these people and how the invasion of Darujistan follows ever closer, and how Malazan actually plans of taking it. Since that floating fortress I mentioned in the beginning, it's a very large factor of why they can't really take the last city. Who knew? As I've mentioned beforehand, it gets quite hard to keep track of the characters. If we look at the list of characters in another novel, this is a companion novel by Ian C. Esselmont called Return of the Crimson Guard, and there are a lot of these. There are like 6 of them, aside from the main series, which are 10 books. So it's quite an undertaking. If we look at the character pages, here, if we can see it, there are... Oh, this is hard. There are a lot of them. There are like 4 or 5 pages with just characters. And that's indicative of the whole Malazan series. And usually you don't get more description of the characters, like Collion, a drunk, or Ralik, an assassin. And that's all you get, so it gets kind of hard to keep track of all these characters. I read it in about a week, and I didn't have much issue, but when he throws all these terms at you and you just want to look it up, is that a person, or is it actually a name of a race, or is it actually a name of a place? It isn't always obvious in the context. And the major issue I have with this book is just characters. It's the characters. One thing he does well about characters is that every single one of them has their own agenda. They always have a goal and they work towards it. And in that sense, they very much feel like real people, and was quite intricate about how all these people are plotting against each other, and they all have their own goals and their own motivations. But he doesn't really give all of them much of a character, since, for example, the head of the Mages Guild, the High Alchemist Barak in Darujistan, he's constantly talking about how to thwart the invasion of Darujistan by the Malazan Empire, and things and how to save his mages. But we don't really get much more of him than him just talking about how to do that. We don't know if he's an angry person by nature. We don't know if what he feels about Malazan Empire. We obviously don't know. We obviously know that he doesn't want to be conquered, but we don't know their role in the greater scheme of things, and how they actually feel and how they actually act as characters outside some context. And that's the problem with such a large cast. There's like 20 people that you follow, and most of them aren't all that well fleshed out. The weird thing about there are a few characters that have arcs, and there are a few characters that I thought were very well realized. Anman the Rake, the commander of this floating fortress called Moonspawn, he has a very interesting character motivation, and we get to know about it in the last fourth of the book for like 2 pages, and I thought that was a really smart idea. But then he doesn't really do anything with it. We just know his motivation, and whoa, that's really cool. What next? And then nothing more really. It doesn't. That's an issue that I have, and most of the people don't even get that. They don't get any motivation and don't do anything with it. They usually just are. This is the thief. This is the assassin. This is the soldier that does this. And he talks a bit funny. For the characters that have arcs, like Paran that I mentioned before, the servant of the adjunct, Loreen, the Empress's right hand, he gets very tired of being used by the Empire constantly. But the problem with these, and suffice to say, he decides to do something about that, since I kind of want this to be a spoiler-free review. He decides to do something about it. But the problem is that this kind of happens out of nowhere. We have him being recruited by the Empress, and we have a time skip where he has been serving 2 years, and then he suddenly meets a mage, and he decides he doesn't want to serve anymore because he doesn't want to be used. But we never see him only being used for others' purposes or anything like that. They just, oh, I'm being used so much. When were you used ever? It's quite frankly annoying. And then he meets then there's a really poorly done romance in very much the same way. Like, oh, we meet, now love scene, now we're done. That's an arc, right? No, it really isn't. And that's quite annoying. There's also the character beats are the weakest point in this. There's also this scene with the adjunct, Loreen, where she comes and she's supposed to be serving like the Empress's right hand, but when she meets her parents' killer, her emotions starts to come through, and she doesn't manage to keep up her appearance, and acts as the person Loreen instead of the adjunct, which is supposed to be objective and only work in service of the Empire and the Empress. But we never see this through her actions. She just starts inquiring about her parents' murderer, and then people tell her, oh, you're acting like a person, and she's like, oh no! And that's it. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but it's really underwhelming, and you start to think when you're reading, where did this motivation come from? It's just so very sudden, so very jarring, and it's not a gradual build-up, but it just happens, which is very transitionally jarring. There's also one scene where she realizes that the Malazan Empire is practically immortal and will always start fighting. That suddenly everything that there will always be a war going on because they can't stop conquering. That she just falls down and cries, and you're just like, what? You just show that you can basically maintain your facade, and in this almost revelation, this like this with this thought, this philosophical thought that you just had in your head, you just collapse and start crying, and that's, the characters don't feel properly built up, and they only react in these overblown emotions, such as like falling down and crying or laughing maniacally or things like that. And I think subtler character writing would have been needed here, and more expanding on the people instead of just focusing on the world building, which is granted a very large focus, and it is rather enjoyable for the most part. It's very obvious, since if we go towards the prose, that Erikson very much thinks in images. He thinks that like these grand floating, I always go back to floating fortress, but it's just so cool, like giant crows flying away, and fireballs being flung. And he does military writing really well. He does like this low grunt writing, and how he describes action scenes and how he describes his world. He does that really well, and he very much thinks in images, since he doesn't do anything spectacular with narration, but he has very cool images in his head, and is very effective at transcribing them or showing them to the reader. But his dialogue is rather stiff, to be honest, and that's why I think he might be leaning on these grand emotions a bit too much. But most of it is very enjoyable. He's really good at action sequences in particular. He makes them very clear, but and very easy to follow, while still sacrificing none of the urgency. And I never lost position of where any of the characters were in relation to each other, which was quite fantastic, to be honest. Since that's a problem I usually have with fantasy books and action scenes within them. And it's rather action-driven, actually. Which was a bit surprising, since it was constantly described to me as this like sprawling Game of Thrones like epic with a lot of politics, but no, it's there's a lot of fighting, a lot of assassinating going on. He also does he's also really good at being clear, while simultaneously having a bit, trying a bit with his formulations and having a bit of the bells and whistles, like I, like I want to usually call them. If we compare him to someone like Sanderson, who is also very clear in his language, but usually he's the bare minimum in not descriptions, but in how he formulates a sentence. He always focuses on clarity and being approachable. Well, Erikson, I think, does a very good mixture between the two. Well, you can like, that's a clever description, and simultaneously never be lost, which is very optimal. It's very great, actually. For example, he describes a crow with its guts torn out, like brightening cherries in the sun, and it was there's very evocative imagery. And I think that's a lot because he thinks very much in images. I think Sanderson is a bit more cinematic, but this is a bit more. This is a little less cinematic, but very much evocative. So, in conclusion, would I recommend this book? Maybe. I think this is a very. It's a very. it's a very special book. I think you're either gonna totally love it or you're totally gonna hate it. I didn't really love it. I think a lot of he just throws in a lot of world building there where it isn't really needed, and while it's good, I still enjoy it. And I think the characters and the story in general is pretty weak. There's while every character has their own agenda, usually it doesn't lead to very much, and there's a lot of Deus Ex Machina going on, and a lot of like, oh lol magic, where you're not really sure what's going on because he hasn't properly explained the magic system, since it depends a lot on lore, but at the same time I really like the world and how he gradually expands upon it without actually expanding upon it, but just explaining. If I didn't already own the second book, this Dead House Gates, I probably wouldn't continue with it. But I think it's a very divisive, that's the word I was looking for. I think it's a very divisive book. So, check it out. And see if you like it. And comment if you want a little more discussion, since I really do enjoy discussion. See ya.